Geki. Welcome to my comparison of Tzolk'in, Teotihuacan, and Tekhenu. Today we're going to take a look at these three games, all by Daniele Tascini, with some collaboration, and compare certain elements of each of them. As I said, I'm Geki. Welcome to my channel. Please check out my other reviews, check out my podcast at Board Game Gambit. But let's dive into this. First, to be clear, I won't explain any of the rules in details. I reviewed Tzolk'in a long time ago, and for Tekhenu and Teotihuacan there are excellent videos that explain the rules and go into some more depth about specifically that. Today I just want to do a not so quick comparison of different aspects of this game, so if you have an idea of what each of these are, or if you want to check it out, you get an idea of how I feel they compare to each other. So let's start with Tzolk'in. Tzolk'in was the first one. It came out in 2012. It's by Daniele Tascini and Simone Luciani for Czech edition games, distributed in the US by Rio Grande, at least in my edition. Tzolk'in is famous for its interlocking wheel mechanism. This is part of the board, and you can see that these wheels are featured prominently. Basically, the way the game works is every turn you place some of your workers, little cylinders, on these wheels, and then, or you take them out. You can do one or the other. You can place as many as you want, as long as you have them. You start with 3, you can acquire more, but the more you place, the more corn, the currency of the game, will cost you. And basically the theme of the game is that the more you leave your workers on the field, on these wheels, the more resources or actions they will award you. So it is a matter of balancing how much stuff do I want now with how much I can wait to let my workers mature. Then in 2018, for NSKN Games, Tascini, working this time alone, came out with Teotihuacan, City of Gods. So we are moving from the Mayan, still in Mesoamerica, but to the Aztecs. This is a dice moving game. You move dice around the board, but the dice are your workers. You never roll them. They simply grow. You change the pips after they take an action, and that makes them more powerful. But when they reach 6, they ascend, which makes the game quicker. You get some bonuses, and the game takes place over 3 eras, and you move around this board. And the main mechanism is every time you land into an action space, the board is upside down, but you can see it anyhow, you have to pay depending on how many dice are there, but then you also get advantages based on how many dice you have there. And so it's collect resources, spend them to build the pyramid, and that's what you're doing in Teotihuacan. Finally, this year, and the reason it prompted me to do this video, this trilogy grew with Tekhenu, Obelisk of the Sun, done by Daniele Tascini with David Turzi for Board and Dice. In this game, where we leave Mesoamerica and jump into ancient Egypt, you are drafting dice from a middle pool. Here, dice will be appearing, and the availability of the dice changes every turn with a rotating obelisk. There will be this telling you which dice you can take and which are tainted and all of that. Again, go look at the video if you want the details of the rules. But basically it's a dice drafting game. So dice recover their functionality of actually being rolled. You pull them from a bag, you roll them, you distribute them, and then you take turns drafting them. So this is the general, very general bird's eye view of these 3 games. I will go through different elements of comparison, and then at the end I will tell you which ones I prefer, and you can tell me in the comments whether you agree or not. So why don't we jump into it with components and general aesthetics of the game. So Tzolk'in, the art is done by Milan Vavron, who did Mage Knight and Underwater Cities. I think it's functional. It's, well, the wheels are certainly the popping piece of the game, but the artwork is also functional. It's very colorful, but still in function of icons being readable and clear and everything being very playable. So I think Milan Vavron does a very good job in not letting the art interfere with the playability while still delivering a game that is pleasant to look at. The building and monuments, things that you can build with resources during the game, are clear enough. They are certainly not gonna win any competition, but they are clear, and that might be important. In terms of components, the wheels are sturdy plastic. They are beige plastic. These were simply washed and painted by my wife. They look a little bland when you open the box, but that's what it is. Components for the players are not great because they're wood, which I like, but they're not even meeples, they're just cylinders, which again makes sense. Clearly the goal was the playability and not the aesthetic presentation. Also consider that it's from 2012, so a different time in games. The currency is corn, which is very simple cardboard tokens, sturdy enough, but nothing to write home. The resources are cubes, with the exception of one of the resources, which are these very cute little crystal skulls, Indiana Jones style. I lost one. You can hear from the noise that they are chunky, and you place them on one of the wheels when you score. Okay, moving on. So I like the aesthetic. I think, however, Teotihuacan is definitely a step above. The board is still very functional, still very colorful, but is chock full of details that are there for aesthetical reason. You can see here, these are the different spots that you move around the board. Here is where you're building the pyramid in the middle. I will get back to that in a moment. You have tracks that you're moving up, which are present in Tzolk'in as well, but here they are nicer. All of the colors are thought of to blend together in a very beautiful board. The use of symbols in the style of the civilization depicted was in its incipit in Tzolk'in, but here it really reaches its full potential. All of these details, the little staircases that lead to the different places, the avenues, and the birds, and the people going around doing their stuff, they make for great visual. Component-wise, also, it's hard to compete with Teotihuacan. The little resources are not cubes, but they are shaped as what they are supposed to be. This is a lingot of gold. Then you have wood, which is not a cube, but a little timber thing. Here you can see it. And so it really brings it home. The dice are functional, they are dice. And on top of all of that, in that middle area, you will be physically building a little pyramid. And every time you place a piece on top, you will check what's underneath. So how you build the pyramid becomes a crucial part of the game, and these are chunky, nice, well decorated pieces of wood. They are also available on BGG, fantastic bags. These I got from my stuff at home, but they went all in providing additional pieces. I'm cheap, so I'm stuck with the standard pieces, but if you like to go all in, you can. On each of these games, by the way, these games are very popular on Etsy. Finally, this year, Tekhenu came out, and it's at the same time very beautiful and less surprising than the others, because we are getting more and more used to games actually looking pretty. The board is very well done. I think I still prefer the Teotihuacan a little bit. It might also be that the colors that they chose to go to are meant to invoke the feeling of the sandy Egypt, and those are more muted than the one on Teotihuacan, and therefore where they actually use color to clearly convey information, and they do a very good job. Sometimes it feels a little too in contrast with the board. But the board is beautiful, the information is clearly depicted, the symbols for the statues and for the gods are very nice. There are also some details, although not as rich as Teotihuacan, but very good, very nice to look at. And that's important in all of these games because you will be staring at the board a lot. They are all games that require you to think carefully about your next move. It also comes with very simple but functional player boards, which carry some information. I wish they had put some more information on the player boards, but the general board actually on that beats both Tzolk'in and Teotihuacan in that in Tekhenu a lot of scoring information and what you are doing when you play stuff is marked on the board. The big component thing in this game is the obelisk. As I said before, there is a little thing that tells you where to place the dice and what dice you can take and what you cannot. And the obelisk is there just as a handle to make this spin. You could play completely without this. Some people do because they don't like the way this sticks onto the board and impede visuals. I find that you can have an easy access to all of the dice that you need, so I do like the sturdy plastic piece, but that's up to you. Where I think Tekhenu comes a little short is in terms of additional components. Again, they didn't manage to find that happy balance between playability and playable information and art that the other two games manage on these tokens. For example, these are supposed to be parts of the temple, but they look just like playing pieces. The colored sides that are one of the elements that you score when you play stuff, they are not great. But where I think Tekhenu could have benefited from improvement, and I'm sure people have done it already and bought their special pieces and all of that, is on these resource tokens. They are cardboard, which is fine, but they went with a very, I don't know, realistic to the period kind of feel. And so you see this is papyrus, which is fine, but is a yellow piece of paper in front of a beige background, and this is gold, which is a yellow piece of gold in front of a beige background. And then you have the same with the stone, etc. And these two in particular, when you look at another player's stock, you can easily get confused. And that could have been, I guess, if they had sacrificed some of the historical accuracy of feeling, because it's still not a very historical game, they could have done something better there. But the board is very good. The dice are fine. They are in these colors that again go very well with the board. And the cards are more than fine. The Arc&Pace of the game. The games are structured around repetition, all three of them. Tzolk'in operates on, there are two scorings, one mid-game, one at the end of the game. The only thing that changes is that you clear the first half of the game buildings and you replace them with the second half of the game buildings, so they become a little more expensive but also with more interesting effects. And you score the temple tracks. There are 3 temple tracks. You want to be high on as many of them as you can because they give you points, plus there is a bonus on each of them for being highest on that specific track. On top of that, you are dealing with feeding your people. You feed them at scoring. You also feed them midway through each scoring. So you feed them 4 times during the game, which is at the same time a way to limit the appeal of getting more workers, since you not only you feed them, but as I mentioned before, you pay more if you play more on the wheels. That combined with the feeding makes it so getting more is not always the right choice, but also provides you with a time concern. You are constantly keeping an eye on how many turns do I have until whatever is next, feeding rounds or scoring rounds. The pace of the game, it's also really interesting because you either place your workers or take your workers out. And when to do that is a very interesting and constantly important choice. From the very first round, do you want to put all of your 3 workers down so that you have more people generating potential actions, or do you want to place two so that in the second round, instead of having to take one out, you want to place another one, let the other grows? Both options are open, both are interesting, and that is repeated throughout the game. The fact that you cannot take one out when you are placing one, and you cannot simply pass and wait, makes it so you are constantly planning a few turns ahead, and that's great. On top of that, when you grab the spot that gives you first player, you can decide to spin the wheel twice, which completely throws off everyone's plans. However, when you do that, your person that is on the first player spot does come back to you, so you're moving everyone higher, but you tend to be less present on the board. And so it's a great interaction of the pace of the game with player decisions that makes it very interesting. So it feels very natural. You go through this thing twice and you have certain moments to meet, and even the scoring with the little skulls, you have to time it because there are 13 spots on that skull track. So if you want to get to the top, you have to start at the latest midway through the game, but probably you want to do that more than once. And so when to start, and sacrificing one of your workers there for a long time because he has to mature and give you a lot of points is tricky, and you may want to make sure that by the time you want to remove it, you have a skull to place. So the pace is very interesting there. Teotihuacan in that sense is very different, very less board dependent and more player dependent. On your turn, you take one die, you move it 1 to 3 spaces. Where you land, you pay resources, you pay cocoa, the currency of the game, based on how many dice are there. Then you take an action that is stronger the more dice of your color that are there, or you take a separate action. And this separate action is what makes, I think, Teotihuacan interesting, because there is a lot to consider. You can get in there, pay whatever you need to pay to get whatever you need to get, or you can take this separate minor action that ignores completely what's there, doesn't grow your die, but gives you some interesting immediate things that can change throughout the game. However, your die is now locked, which means that every turn you have a variety of choices. Even when you have decided which die to move and decided where to move it, and already you have multiple dice and each can move multiple spaces. So the pace is very self-regulated, but very interesting. The fact that to unlock these dice, you can either pass one turn, which is not great, and you unlock all of your dice, or pay 3 food, also makes it more dynamic. And the fact that action change cost and effect based on how many dice are there means that you're constantly pacing yourself with other players. Oh, I don't want to move out because otherwise I make it cheaper for them, but also I want to get there before someone else gets there. And I think it's very good. The arc is not as exciting. It's divided on 3 eras rather than 2 scoring like the other 2 games, and that's absolutely fine. However, the relevance of end era scoring feels less important, and so it almost feels like it's there because it wants to be there. While in Tzolk'in and in Tekhenu, the end of a phase of a game feels super important. The eclipse, which what ends each of these 3 eras, in Teotihuacan feels less relevant. It's another thing to keep track of. Obviously, it's not irrelevant. There are scorings. You score for the Avenue of the Dead, and you score for having been the one who built the most pieces of the pyramid. But there are so many other things to keep track that Teotihuacan feels more like it's just one arc, and therefore the repetition sometimes gets a little annoying. Tekhenu, so let's first clarify that I've played Tekhenu way less than the others. I've played Teotihuacan a dozen times, Tzolk'in 50 times, and Tekhenu twice. So take that with a grain of salt, but I really like the pace and the arc in Tekhenu. It's a game where you take 16 actions and 16 actions only. Obviously there are additional ripple effects like in all of these games from your actions, but 16 times you draft a die from the board and you do something with it. And every 2 dice that you take, the obelisk spins, changing the situation. And every 4 of them, you have a mat phase where you have to balance the dice that you've taken and where the turn order changes. And then every 2 mats, so every 8 actions, you have a scoring, and you will have 2 in the game. And everything that I said about Tzolk'in with the scoring is also true here. There are majorities, there are static points that you generate, and all of that. So I think that both the arc and the pace in Tekhenu are very good. The pace is you take 1 die every turn, so very standard. I take a die, you take a die, they take a die, I take a die, you take a die, they take a die. We do this 4 times, and in the middle we bring out new dice. After 4 times, maybe the order changes, and now they take a turn first, and then you, and then me. And I think that that's so simple, just draft the die, but the rhythm and the limitations on where you can take it make it very, very interesting. At the same time, on your turn, you take 1 die and you move on. You don't have to pay for people who are already there. You don't have to decide whether, like in Teotihuacan, you want to actually take resources or get the currencies that you need to be able to pay more. And even when you do decide to get resources in Tekhenu, it's still up to you to take a die. It makes it a little more plannable. It makes it richer. I really like it. The arc, again, I will have to play this more, but it feels very relevant. You want to be in the position to score at the end of the first scoring, but it's more exciting at the end of the second scoring. So if Tzolk'in, I feel Tzolk'in is the one where you need to be on top of the scoring even midway, so it keeps you a little bit more on your toes. Teotihuacan is the one where actually the end of the era scoring tend to matter less than what you do in other moments of the game. And Tekhenu lives and die by the end game, where you bring in the end of your different scorings. There are certain things that are repeated from the first one, but now you score more, for example, the number of statues that you have built, and there are end game stuff. This leads me into ease of teaching and ease of playing. As I mentioned before, I find Teotihuacan the wonkiest of them all. It has a lot that gets in the way of each and every single action. So the fact that which dice you count, so you move to a spot and immediately you have to make a decision between going for the little locking action that is completely independent from the main action or going for the main action. If you go for the main action, you have to decide whether you want to pay cocoa to be able to do the action, and that counts all of the dice that are already there, different colors, plus the one that you, plus 1 basically, or if you want to pay that cost to be able to take the action. So you either take the cocoa or pay the cocoa. If you pay the cocoa, you then compare the number of dice that you have there with the pips on the lowest die that you have there. There is a chart. Most of these actions are represented as a physical chart. So you go, oh, I have 2 dice, of which the lowest is a 2, I get 2 stone. It can be a lot. Not only can be a lot to explain, but also it can be very slow to play. And often people go, oh, I'll do this and that. Oh no, because then I don't have cocoa anymore, so let me do this instead. And it can get a little machinose and a little overwrought. So that the pace is not, as I said, the best, and this also makes it so that you, while the rules themselves are not more complicated in the other 2, there are a lot of things that you have to consider on each move, and so it will slow down. Proof being that the first time I played this with 4 players, it went on for over 3.5 hours, while when I played the first time Tekhenu with 3 players, we were done in less than 2 hours, and Tzolk'in similar. So true, we were playing with 4, but also it went much longer than the others. Tzolk'in, I think, I find it the easiest to teach. It might be because I have done it often, but in terms of explaining it, is you either place workers, and the more workers you play, the more you pay, and there is a easy reminder on your player board, or you remove workers. You cannot do both. If you remove a worker, that's when they activate. So when you're placing, you only have to think of what you want to do in the future, and it's only when you take workers, and you can take them in any order, you do whatever you want. You don't have a cost to resolve the action. So when you're placing, you're thinking about cost, and when you're resolving, you're simply thinking about the action. And each track, with one exception, each wheel with one exception, has a dedicated scope. So here is the wheel where you place the skulls to get points. Here is the wheel where you get food and wood. And here is the wheel where you get resources. Here is the wheel where you move on technologies or you build buildings. And this is the one that has a little bit of everything, and I will explain that. It has specific moments of scoring that you have to take care of. They are marked very clearly on the wheels. It's very easy for me to explain, and I feel that translates also in an ease of play. Sure, doing well is complicated, but easing players into what they need to do is not that tough. I want to talk about the different avenues to score, the different strategies, and the overall depth of the game. So, Tzolk'in is a game that rewards, I think, repeated play, much like the others. However, it must be said right off the gate that it has been available online for a long time on Board Game Arena, which makes it faster and quicker. Tekhenu and Teotihuacan are available on Tabletop Simulator, which again simulate the board game, while Board Game Arena makes it almost as a click and resolve board game. And so people have played it hundreds of times, and by playing it hundreds of times, they have found ways to not necessarily break the game, but make it so that only one or two strategies are available. Normally in the game, you can choose to do different things. You can build buildings and monuments, which obviously requires you to get resources, and they give you some benefits, and they also lead to points, but mostly interact with other things. You can go for the skulls. You collect the skulls and you drop them on the corresponding wheel, and those can give you a lot of points and move you up on the temples. And the temples are the third way to score points, where it's the most competitive because you want to be ahead of other players. Score only twice during the game, but they can score you significant points, and they give you resources midway through each of those scorings. However, there is one spot on the game that is the market, that allows you to convert corn into resources, or vice versa, or exchange resources into corn. And people have found ways to exploit that so that they completely ignore one part of the game, say ignore the resources, or vice versa, completely ignore the corn part, and simply use that to convert one into the other. Which means that all of the technologies that deal with the other thing, all of the buildings that deal with the other thing, become completely irrelevant to them. I think that there is no doubt that that's a problem, and Simone Luciani has addressed that online, proposing a variant where you limit the amount of transactions that can be done. It was clearly an oversight, because I feel that, also based on how accessible that spot is on the board, that was meant to be simply a correction. Oh, I got too much wood, I need one fewer wood, one more stone. Or, oh, what do I do with this extra food? And so I feel that even the restriction is too bland, but it is to be considered that as it is written, people who know how to do it can make the game boring. It's not a strategy that wins 100% of the time, but it's close, it's easy to execute, and it's boring. So while I love Tzolk'in, it must be said that as written, all of these different strategies are not equivalent. However, it's an easy fix. I play with an easy fix. It also doesn't come up very often in games that I play on the table with people who are not so in deep in this game. I think it's a deep game with fresh and different variability. Tekhenu Tekhenu is the last one to come out, and yet and therefore probably it offers so many variable ways to score. You can score points with statues. Statues can also instead be used to give you ongoing bonuses whenever someone takes an action. Statues, by the very fact of building them, regardless of where you build them, will give you points at the scoring moments. You can build pillars, which give you points when you build them and give you little benefits. You can build buildings, which give you resources, but also put you in the run for majorities, or you can build it elsewhere where they give you points and additional resources. You can move your population and your happiness up, which give you points straight up on scoring and allow you to access the cards, which I will talk more about in a moment. But there are some cards that give you endgame scoring for doing virtually everything. And on top of that, you're trying to balance your dice not to lose points. And so there is a lot of things that you need to consider, and they all work together. I don't see something akin to Tzolk'in where you choose between one technology or the other. You have to react to the dice, and so you will be doing a little bit of everything. But I feel that there are different things to consider and different ways to win the game, which are very interesting. Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan also presents different ways to score. You have the Way of the Dead, which is a track that gives you a multiplier for the buildings that you have built. There is the temple tracks, much like in Tzolk'in, although I feel they are less interesting because they are longer and less dynamic. So it's a longer slog of small movements, while in Tzolk'in, when you move up on a temple, you are gunning for the top much more directly. Teotihuacan lives and dies by the middle pyramid, which is visually the center of the game, is very resource involved, so a lot of things that you do deal with that. And I feel that's where Teotihuacan for me loses something, because that pyramid is not as exciting as it sounds. It's a lot of finding the right spot to place when you build, but you will find it. It's just a matter of time. So it's just a matter of sometimes telling, okay, do you want to tell me which one is better, or I will simply spend my time and my turn will become longer, and everyone does that. So it's an added set of choices which doesn't make it more interesting. I've not played with the expansion. I've heard good things about the expansion. As it is, Teotihuacan has different ways to do things that don't feel that much varied. So the last thing that I wanted to connect to this is variability. And I want to talk about extrinsic variability, how different the components and the things make the board and the game state every time, and intrinsic variability, which is how different the game will feel every time. So Tzolk'in has for sure the most reduced extrinsic variability. The buildings are only divided in two stacks, first half and second half of the game, and you will use most of them every game. Often they run out. So it means that the only thing that changes really is which ones come out first. And I think, however, that the way you interact with the other players' pieces means that every game will be quite different. Like the other two, one great innovation that was introduced in Tzolk'in and has been used in the other two games and in many games since is that at the beginning you don't have a fixed amount of resources, but you get 4 tiles that tell you a mixture of resources, movements on the temple tracks, or movements on the technology tracks. You choose 2 of them. So every game you start with different stuff. And with the fact that you start with different stuff, that players act differently. And yes, that some difference in the order of what buildings come out when happens. I feel that Tzolk'in, with very little extrinsic variability, offers a great and deep amount of intrinsic variability. Teotihuacan is not the opposite, but Teotihuacan has a lot of extrinsic variability. Everything is randomizable. These big charts with the actions, you have tiles to replace them so that every time you play you can shuffle them up and change the order, and each little bonus here you place a little tile and those change each game and through the game. And similar things I use for the temple tracks and for the palace tile, which is one of the actions. And the way the tokens come out in the pyramid certainly determine which points you will be getting and how many points and how many movement on the temple tracks. And the technologies are not fixed tracks like in Tzolk'in, where you have technologies that deal with different various aspects of the game and you simply grow into those. Here there are 6 unique technologies and you choose out of 12, I think, and that changes considerably the extrinsic situation of the game. I feel that that doesn't necessarily translate in this much difference in the feeling of the game, probably because being so varied, they are also relatively minor. So, for example, the order of the actions, sure, that avoids falling into I will do the same thing every game, but I don't think that's necessarily needed. And the little variable things, they are different, but again, the situation in the game would have been enough. Again, it comes back to the fact that the difference in the pyramid is more a nuisance than a virtue for the game. However, there is no doubt that among the 3, Teotihuacan is the one that you cannot ever possibly have a game with the same setup at any point during the game. Everything will be different. You can play this hundreds of times and find something different every time, something that is not true of Tzolk'in. Tekhenu seems to take the best of the 2, again, not surprisingly, being that it benefits from the experience of the other 2 designs. So Tekhenu needs less extrinsic variety because the dice limit you in what you can do. Nonetheless, it still manages to do so in having different pillars, so one of the actions changes throughout the game, the offer, and you have to deal with what is out there, much like the building in Tzolk'in, but since it's only an offer of 3 rather than an offer of 6, you are more beholden to what actually is showing. But where the extrinsic variety of Tekhenu comes into play is in the cards. There is a display of cards which are a set mix of blessings, cards that you take and you can use at any one point during the game for one-time benefits, technologies, and endgame scoring. The endgame scoring are very varied, which means that depending on what you collect, anything you do in the game can be worth points. So there is not a fixed strategy that is more rewarding than others. But where I think it really shines is the technologies. The technologies are smaller than in Tzolk'in and then Teotihuacan, but more varied, and you can get more of them. There are, I think, 30 or so different little cards that give you a little different bonus for different actions, and you can combine them to make certain action very powerful, or vice versa, you can have a little bit whenever you do whatever. And the way they are collected, the fact that you're not limited, the fact that they change a lot throughout the game, make that, I think, the most noticeable source of differential variability in Tekhenu. That combined with the one-time bonuses. So this brings me to the closing. I think that they are all 3 very solid games. In a vacuum, each of them would be excellent. I am trying to compare them because they feel similar in feeling. Some of you, much like me, will like having all 3 of them. I actually cannot wait for whatever Daniele Tascini has in store next. He has quickly become one of my favorite designers, even if some of these didn't meet my expectation, like Trismegistus. However, if I had to rank them right now, Tzolk'in is one of my favorite games. I have played it so much that it's starting to feel a little similar, but I still will play it with whoever wants anytime, and I really, really like it. Teotihuacan for me is the weakest of the 3. I know that I am not necessarily in the majority on that opinion. Teotihuacan has had great success. I think it's a game that works very fine, but compared to the other 2, it has a few things that doesn't need. And so it sits in a weird place where the complexity is a little over its depth. Tzolk'in and Tekhenu fit that medium weight Euro space. Depending on your preference, you can consider it medium heavy or medium light. For me, it's medium, and that is always reliably under 2 hours, always reliably over an hour and 50 minutes. They both deliver a deep but still accessible play. Teotihuacan, in my opinion, adds a little bit too much so that the depth remains more or less on the same level, but the complexity and all of the things that you have to go through, from setup to each individual move, to the collecting the food, to the dealing with this pyramid, doesn't need to be there. And so it falls a little bit behind. Tekhenu shows promise. The setting doesn't allure me as much as Tzolk'in, and this thing is not as interesting to me as the wheels. However, it has the potential to be a game that I will play over and over again, my game group allowing, if they also like it. I can't wait to explore more technologies, more action, trying different strategies. And I must say that it hadn't been in a long while since at least Lorenzo, and going back all the way to Tzolk'in, that I have had a game that I want to explore so much. So this has been my comparison. Whichever feels interesting to you, you won't be wrong. And if you like one, I don't think you will dislike any of the others, despite them being very different. So let me know in the comments what you think. Feel free to reach out to me on BGG or here on YouTube. Consider please subscribing to the channel, and check out our podcast at Board Game Gambit, link in the description. This has been my comparison of Daniele Tascini's trilogy, Tzolk'in, Teotihuacan City of Gods, and Tekhenu. Thank you for watching. I've been Geki. See you next time.